Berbice, February 1763. On the river plantations, the blood of masters stained the cane fields. Whips once raised now fell silent, their wielders cut down by the very people they enslaved. In the blaze of fire and smoke stood Cuffy, an Akan man, no longer a slave but a leader. He killed his masters not out of blind rage, but to end decades of torture, to defend broken families, to turn chains into swords of justice. For 5 months, Berbice was his realm, a living challenge hurled against an empire. In the mid-18th century, Berbice was a colony of the Dutch, nestled along the muddy rivers of what is now Guyana. On the surface, it was paradise for planters, vast plantations of sugar, coffee, and cotton, crops that flowed across the Atlantic to feed Europe's endless hunger. But beneath that glittering wealth was a darker truth. The land itself was soaked in sweat, and every stalk of cane was watered with the blood of enslaved Africans. Life on these plantations was nothing short of a sentence to slow death. The men and women dragged from Africa worked from sunrise until nightfall, their backs bent under the tropical sun, their bodies wasted by exhaustion and disease. Malaria swept through the swamps. Dysentery claimed the weak, and for those who faltered, the whip was always waiting. Flesh tore, bones broke, and screams carried through the humid air. Children were born into bondage, and often torn away before they could even remember their mothers' faces. Husbands were separated from wives, families scattered like seeds across the plantations. To the Dutch planters, Africans were not people but hands, tools for profit, commodities that could be replaced when they broke down. Yet beneath this machinery of cruelty, a quiet strength endured. Among the enslaved was a man named Cuffy, of Akan origin from West Africa. The Akan were no strangers to leadership, to councils of elders, to the pride of kingdoms that had once stood tall across the Gold Coast. Stripped of his homeland and chained to labor in Berbice, Cuffy carried within him memories of a different life, memories that refused to be silenced by the crack of the Dutch whip. Every day he witnessed the brutality of the system, men collapsing under the weight of sugarcane, women punished until their backs were ribbons of flesh, elders discarded once they could no longer keep pace. He saw friends die from hunger, their bellies swollen from disease rather than food. He saw children cry themselves to sleep, too young to understand why they had been born into shackles. And yet, despite the cruelty, stories traveled quietly among the enslaved, tales of resistance in Africa, of revolts on other islands, whispers that freedom was not a dream but a fire waiting to be lit. These whispers moved like the wind through cane fields, carrying the seeds of rebellion. Berbice may have seemed like a prison without walls, but for men like Cuffy, the prison had cracks. The cracks were in the cruelty itself, in the unbearable weight of injustice. One day, something would give way, and when it did, Berbice would burn. The whip was more than a tool of discipline, it was the emblem of Dutch power. Its hiss through the air was the sound of authority, its strike the reminder that no enslaved person was safe from sudden violence. On the plantations, the overseer's lash carved stories into flesh, lines of pain that spoke of endless submission. For every cane row left unfinished, every pause to catch a breath, the answer was the same: leather across skin, a mark to remind the body of its place. Cuffy knew that place all too well. He had felt the sting of the lash and had seen others endure far worse. A man caught with too little strength was whipped until he collapsed, his body trembling in the dirt, sometimes never to rise again. Women who resisted advances or spoke too boldly were punished with ruthless cruelty. In Berbice, the whip was the law, and the law had no mercy. But pain does not always breed silence. Sometimes it breeds memory. For every scream that echoed, there was someone who remembered. For every wound carved into flesh, there was a scar that refused to fade. Cuffy carried these memories like burning coals in his chest. He remembered the faces of men who had starved after working from dawn until dusk, their bodies wasted and thrown aside as if they were nothing. He remembered friends who collapsed under loads too heavy to bear, punished even as life slipped from them. He remembered the smell of blood in the fields, so sharp it mixed with the sweetness of sugarcane. What the Dutch planters never understood was that cruelty could unite as much as it could terrorize. The lash did not only mark the back, it etched stories into the community. Around the fires at night, when the overseers were gone, those who survived whispered about the dead. They honored them in hushed tones, their memories binding the living together in a silent pact. Cuffy listened, he watched, he waited. In those fireside gatherings, he saw not only grief but a simmering rage that could not be extinguished. When he looked at the whip, he no longer saw only pain. He saw a spark, and sparks, in time, become flames. Night in Berbice was different from the day. By day, the cane fields stretched endlessly, a prison of green under a punishing Sunday. But by night, the world softened. Fires flickered in small huts, voices lowered to whispers, and within those whispers lived the seeds of revolution. Cuffy sat among his people, listening to the soft, urgent tones. "If we do not rise, we will die here," one man muttered, his voice breaking under the weight of years. A woman added, "Better to fight and fall with dignity than to watch our children grow in chains." These were not idle words. They were the beginnings of a decision, a collective truth that could no longer be ignored. The Akan, the Congo, the Igbo, different peoples torn from Africa, different languages and customs, but in Berbice, they had been forced into the same crucible of suffering. That crucible forged unity. The drumbeats of memory still echoed in their chests, rhythms of home that could never be silenced. In the silence of the night, those rhythms became a heartbeat, shared by many. Cuffy, quiet but steady, emerged as the one to give those whispers form. He was not the loudest or the fiercest, but his calm strength carried weight. When he spoke, others leaned in. "We cannot fight only for revenge," he said. "Revenge dies when the blood dries. We must fight for what will live after us, for children who are not yet born, for families who will never know these chains." The words struck deep. Around him, men and women nodded, their eyes catching the glow of the fire. For the first time, they began to imagine something larger than themselves, a land where no master held the whip, where food was planted for families, not for profit, where songs could rise without fear of punishment. Still, fear lingered. The Dutch were powerful. Their guns were real. Their reinforcements could arrive at any time. But the choice had narrowed. To remain silent was to watch generations disappear into the earth without ever tasting freedom. To rise was to risk death, but also to risk life. As the whispers thickened into resolve, Cuffy felt the weight of what was coming. The future was fragile, a candle flame trembling in the wind. But in the hearts of those gathered, that flame grew steadier with every passing night. Somewhere in the distance, the river carried the sound of the forest. It seemed to murmur back, as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment. The rebellion was no longer a dream, it was becoming inevitable. February 1763. The river plantations of Berbice woke not to the routine of labor, but to chaos. At first, it was a single blaze, one estate set alight, its cane fields turning into torches against the night. Then another, and another. Flames leapt into the sky, painting the horizon in red and gold. The rebellion had begun. Enslaved men and women, armed not with tools but with stolen weapons, surged against their overseers. Masters who once commanded with whips now fell beneath the fury of those they had chained. It was sudden, it was swift, and it was unstoppable. For decades, the plantations had stood as monuments to Dutch power. Now, within hours, they became ruins of fire and ash. Cuffy was there, his figure sharp against the burning fields. In one hand, he held the weapon that marked the turning of fate. No longer a laborer bent under the sun, he stood tall, eyes fixed on freedom. His voice cut through the din, rallying those around him. "This is not the end," he called. "This is the beginning." The rebellion spread like wildfire, moving faster than word could travel. Plantations collapsed, masters fled or fell, and the enslaved claimed the land with a ferocity born of generations of pain. The Dutch, caught unprepared, staggered under the weight of the uprising. Yet Cuffy urged restraint amid the storm. He knew the rebellion could not survive if it became only bloodshed. "Do not kill for killing's sake," he warned. "Every blow must build the future, not destroy it." But in the smoke and confusion, not all shared his vision. Some struck without mercy, their rage too deep to contain. Still, the rebellion was more than violence. It was fire, as symbol the blaze that devoured the plantations was also the light of justice. To those who had lived their lives under the shadow of the whip, it was the first dawn of dignity. As the smoke drifted upward, it carried a message across the colony. The enslaved had risen, and Berbice would never be the same. In the chaos of burning plantations and fleeing masters, leadership was no luxury, it was survival. Among the voices shouting for vengeance, one figure rose to steady the storm. It was Cuffy. Calm, where others were frenzied. Focused, where others were blinded by rage. He became the anchor of the rebellion. The people chose him, not by decree but by instinct. They needed a leader who could see beyond the fire of the moment, someone who could mold fury into order. Cuffy stepped into that role with a solemnity that carried the weight of centuries. He began by gathering the fighters, men who had armed themselves with machetes, muskets stolen from the Dutch, or simple farming tools turned into weapons. He divided them into groups, setting captains over each, building structure from chaos. For the first time, the enslaved were no longer scattered individuals, but an army. Cuffy's vision stretched further than the battlefield. He called the community together, men, women, children, and spoke with a voice that cut through smoke and fear. "We are not only here to destroy," he declared. "We are here to build. This land, these rivers, these fields, they will no longer feed the empire. They will feed us. From this day forward, Berbice belongs not to our masters, but to ourselves." His words struck like thunder. People who had never known agency, who had been treated as tools, now stood hearing themselves named as a nation. For the first time, the enslaved imagined themselves as something greater than victims. They were citizens of a new land in the making. Cuffy also looked outward. He understood that no rebellion could endure in isolation. He drafted letters to the Dutch governor, offering negotiations. "We do not seek endless war," one message read, "but recognition. Give us the land we have claimed, and let us live as free men." It was a bold move, part diplomacy, part challenge. To the Dutch, it was unthinkable. A former slave speaking not as property, but as an equal. But to Cuffy's followers, it was revolutionary. He was not just leading them in arms, he was declaring their humanity to the world. As the weeks unfolded, the rebellion grew in size and scope. Villages formed in liberated zones, families reunited, and fields once worked under compulsion were replanted for sustenance. Cuffy moved among them, not as a tyrant, but as a guide, shaping the fragile beginnings of freedom. Still, danger loomed. The Dutch would not ignore the rebellion forever. Cuffy knew reinforcements would come. Yet for now, Berbice breathed in a way it never had before. For the first time, the colony had a leader of its own choosing, and his name was Cuffy. The months that followed were unlike anything Berbice had ever seen. For 5 brief but extraordinary months, Cuffy presided over a land carved out of fire and sacrifice. What had begun as a revolt had become something bolder, a fledgling state, ruled by one who had once worn chains. Cuffy established order where there had been only rebellion. He oversaw the redistribution of land, dividing fields so families could plant food for themselves rather than for export. He organized patrols to guard against surprise attacks and set up councils to hear grievances. Under his leadership, the freed people were not merely fighters, they were citizens, learning the rhythms of self-rule. There was music again. In villages along the river, drums echoed through the night, not as signals of warning but as celebrations of survival. Children played near the water without the fear of an overseer's whip. Women who had once bent under forced labor now planted gardens for their families. It was as though Berbice itself had been reborn. Yet Cuffy was no idealist blinded to reality. He knew the Dutch still lurked, regrouping, waiting for reinforcements from across the ocean. That was why he continued his attempts at negotiation, sending messages that blended strength with pragmatism. He demanded recognition of the new order, even offering to partition Berbice, part for the Dutch, part for the free. To the colonizers, it was an audacious proposal. To his followers, it was proof that Cuffy sought not only victory, but permanence. This was the high tide of the rebellion, the moment when possibility seemed limitless. A man once whipped and chained now governed a territory larger than many European principalities. To the outside world, it was scandalous, even terrifying. The idea that the enslaved could seize and hold power. But within Berbice, it was intoxicating. People who had never known freedom now walked with their heads high, speaking of futures beyond survival. They called Cuffy captain, leader, sometimes even king. He accepted none of these titles lightly. To him, leadership was a burden as much as an honor, a task carried not for himself but for the generations yet to come. For a brief, brilliant moment, Berbice was no longer just a colony of the Dutch Empire. It was something rarer, a kingdom of freedom, carved from the heart of oppression. And at its center stood Cuffy, the unlikely ruler who had transformed rebellion into governance, fire into fragile hope. For the first time in living memory, the air of Berbice was different. It no longer carried the constant sting of fear, the hiss of whips, or the cries of the beaten. Instead, It was alive with sounds of renewal. Laughter by the river, the beat of drums, the hum of work done by free hands. The rebellion had not only broken chains, it had opened a window into another world. Families once torn apart began to rebuild. Children who had never known a day without labor were suddenly free to play. They chased each other along the riverbanks, their feet splashing in the shallows, their voices carrying across the water like songs of a new age. Women gathered in the mornings to plant crops not for Dutch masters, but for their own tables. Corn, cassava, and vegetables rose from the soil, nourished not by obligation, but by love. The fields themselves seemed transformed. Where once they had stood as monuments to oppression, now they promised sustenance, belonging, and hope. Songs, long forbidden or muted, filled the evenings. The Akan sang of distant homelands. The Congo sang of rivers and forests left behind. The Igbo lifted their voices in call and response. In these songs, cultures once fractured by slavery found new strength. It was not Africa reborn, nor Europe imposed, but something unique, a culture of survival becoming a culture of freedom. Cuffy walked among his people and saw this rebirth with pride and pain. Pride, because he knew the uprising had given them this chance. Pain, because he knew it was fragile. At night, when others slept, he would stand near the river, staring into the dark waters, imagining Dutch ships already crossing the Atlantic with soldiers and guns. He knew the Empire would not forgive what Berbice had done. Still, he allowed himself to believe, if only for a moment, that perhaps the Dutch would yield, that perhaps his letters offering peace and partition might be accepted. Perhaps this dream could hold. To the people, those months felt like the dawning of a new world. They spoke of freedom as though it were permanent, as though the walls of slavery had crumbled for good. For many, even if only briefly, the nightmare had ended. Dreams are fragile, but they matter. They give the weary strength to endure. In those months, Berbice dreamed of a tomorrow where the whip was nothing but a memory, and that dream would echo long after the fire was extinguished. But freedom is rarely simple, and dreams are never without shadows. Even as Berbice flourished under Cuffy's rule, divisions began to surface. The unity forged in fire now strained under the weight of different visions for the future. Some saw Cuffy's willingness to negotiate with the Dutch as betrayal. "We fought, we bled, we burned the plantations," one rival leader argued. "Why speak to those who enslaved us? They deserve only death." Others, hardened by years of brutality, demanded that every Dutch settler be killed without mercy. For them, compromise was weakness, and peace was impossible. Cuffy, however, held firm. He believed survival demanded more than vengeance. "If we kill them all, the Empire will return with greater force," he warned. "If we negotiate, perhaps we can secure land, perhaps even recognition." His vision was long-term, aimed at creating a sustainable future. But to those consumed by rage, his words sounded like surrender. The conflict split the movement. Rival factions formed, each with its own leader, each pulling followers away from Cuffy's authority. Where once the rebellion had been one heart beating in unison, now it was many hearts, discordant and clashing. The cracks widened. Some villages began to act independently, raiding Dutch settlements without coordination, provoking retaliation that endangered the entire rebellion. Trust eroded. Whispers of betrayal spread through camps. Suspicion grew, and with it, fear. Cuffy felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had dreamed of a free Berbice united under justice, but now he faced a fractured reality. At times, he wondered whether leadership itself had become a chain. His heart ached not only from the looming threat of the Dutch, but from the disunity within his own people. The Dutch, watching from afar, recognized these cracks and waited. Every division among the rebels was a gift to the Empire. They knew time was on their side. If Berbice could not hold itself together, they would not need to break it, the people would do that themselves. Freedom had been won in fire, but now it risked crumbling in silence. The rebellion's greatest enemy was no longer just the Dutch. It was the rebellion itself. By May of 1763, the dream was trembling. Cuffy's people had tasted freedom, but the Dutch were not idle. Across the ocean, reinforcements had been summoned. Soldiers, muskets, and gunpowder arrived to reclaim the jewel of their empire. With each passing week, the pressure mounted. At first, the Dutch probed with small attacks, testing the rebels' defenses. The freed fighters resisted fiercely, using the forests and rivers as shields. But as the Dutch strength grew, the imbalance became undeniable. Their cannons spoke a language the rebels could not answer. Their discipline, drilled into them across decades of European wars, clashed with the passion but inexperience of men who had once been forced to farm. Inside the rebellion, the cracks widened into chasms. Rival leaders ignored Cuffy's orders, staging reckless raids that drained resources and provoked retaliation. Arguments flared over whether to negotiate, retreat deeper into the forest, or continue the fight. Suspicion poisoned trust. Whispers of betrayal lingered in every camp. The unity that had once burned bright now flickered dangerously low. Cuffy fought not only against the Dutch but against despair itself. He pleaded with his people to hold together, to see that division was their greatest enemy. But his voice, once commanding, now seemed distant to some. Power that had been given by trust was being pulled away by doubt. As the Dutch pressed forward, villages were burned, crops destroyed, and families once again scattered. The dream of Berbice as a free land shrank with each acre reclaimed by the colonizers. For Cuffy, the tragedy was unbearable. He had not fought merely to destroy chains, he had fought to build a new nation. To see that nation unravel from within cut deeper than any whip. When defeat loomed certain, Cuffy made a choice that would forever mark his legacy. Rather than fall into Dutch hands, to be paraded, tortured, and humiliated as a warning to others, he chose his own end. It was not surrender but defiance. By taking his own life, he denied the empire the spectacle of his suffering. He preserved his dignity, even as the rebellion collapsed. The fall of Berbice was brutal. Thousands were killed, captured, or driven back into chains. The Dutch reasserted control, their empire scarred but not broken. Yet in the ashes of defeat, a memory smoldered. For 5 months, an enslaved man had ruled. For 5 months, Berbice had lived free. That fact could never be erased. The rebellion was crushed, but Cuffy's name endured. To the Dutch, he was a rebel, a criminal, a danger to be forgotten. To the people of Guyana, he became something else entirely. A hero, a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest times, freedom could be seized. Legends of Cuffy spread beyond Berbice. His story was told in whispers across the Caribbean, carried by sailors and survivors, remembered in songs and prayers. He was not remembered merely for killing his masters, though he had done that, but for what he represented. The possibility of justice, the vision of a community living for itself. Generations later, when Guyana sought to define itself, Cuffy's name rose again. Statues were built in his honor. His rebellion was remembered not as a failure but as a first spark in a long fire of resistance. Today, the 3rd of March, Cuffy Day, is celebrated as a national holiday in Guyana, a tribute to the man who dared to turn slaves into citizens, who dared to dream of a free Berbice. The questions he left behind are as alive now as they were in 1763. What does freedom demand? Is it vengeance or justice? Is it survival or the creation of something greater than ourselves? Cuffy's life did not give simple answers, but his struggle forced those questions into history. Standing in the ruins of his rebellion, one might imagine his voice echoing, "We are not only here to destroy, we are here to build." The empire returned, the chains were reforged, but the idea he planted outlived them all. Today, when Guyanese children learn his name, they learn not only about death and defeat, but about dignity. They learn that for 5 months, their ancestors took destiny into their own hands. They learn that a man once whipped, chained, and forgotten could rise to become the father of freedom in their land. And perhaps the greatest tribute is this: the Dutch records may have tried to label him a rebel, but the people call him a leader. His flame may have burned briefly, but its glow never truly faded. Cuffy's story reminds us that history is not only written by the victors. Sometimes it is carried by the defeated, by those who fought, fell, and yet refused to vanish. If stories like Cuffy's stir you, subscribe to Murder Files Television, because some names, no matter how empires try to bury them, were never meant to disappear in silence.